wanted to start by kind of introducing the purpose of these two sessions. So it's going to be one 90-minute session before lunch and then a 60-minute session after lunch. For those of you who want to continue talking over lunch, there's an ideal opportunity through that setup. The broader idea behind this is that, you know, with the CBD COP, the Conventional Biological Diversity COP, the policy developments there, and the broader narratives like in dialogues and solutions being proposed in the international community are making very large demands on land for a singular goal, which is conservation. You know, there's been proposals for half Earth, there's been proposals for 30%, there's been proposals for 20%. But you know, in land system science, we talk about the multiple goals that we have on land and how there's almost always plural values and trade-offs. But within this, you know, global system, there's a really heavy focus on the single value of conservation. So, in light of all of that, and the fact that, you know, I'm, for instance, based in the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, surrounded by a lot of people who consider themselves primarily conservation scientists, and they actually have no idea that there's even a thing called land system science. And I'm like, it's pretty cool, you should check it out. So the focus of this session is to try to connect this demands on land for conservation, this field of conservation science, with all of the sort of, I think, much more plural, much more complex systems, a much more multi-scalar community of science that's called, you know, land system science in the Global Land Program. So that's all I'm going to say because Tobias is actually going to start us out with the conceptual piece of this, and we're going to explore some of the trade-offs and opportunities that emerge through thinking about conservation as a land use, and in my view, also thinking of it as a land use policy. So I'll turn it over to Tobias Kuemmerle, who's a professor at Humboldt University in Berlin.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Rachael. Just to say that this is sort of becoming a bit of a tradition to have these seminars or these sessions where we try to connect land system science and conservation science. I think it's the third GLP OSM where we have these types of sessions, so this is another one on the idea of conservation as a land use. Now, thank you all for coming. People are still coming in. There is chairs over here. Apologies for my voice. That has nothing to do with the 50 liters of mezcal those yesterday, obviously. And I appreciate very much to see a few people that were on the dance floor until the end here in this session. Yes. So what I want to talk about here is the idea of conceptualizing area-based conservation as a land use. And I want to say that this is sort of a status report on discussions that we're having in our research group. There are several people here who have contributed to this. Anna is sitting over there. I see you somewhere. Marie is over there. But also Rachael and Patrick Mefa, who's presenting in another session probably. As well as a few people that are more deeply rooted in conservation science, such as Jonas Geldman, for example, of Pierre Visconti, with whom we have discussed this a lot. So this is a bit where we stand with this, and we are hoping for feedback now in this session or also afterwards. Okay, so our starting point is this. Our starting point is this, a pretty obvious one. Land use and land use change are the main drivers of biodiversity loss, mainly through habitat destruction, but also the other things that come with habitat destruction, all the threats that are connected to landscapes like that, deforestation in the Amazon, so things like poaching or pollution, other factors that we normally not directly associate with land use change, but are a consequence of changing land use. Because of land use change being the main driver of biodiversity loss currently, it's also clear that then conservation somehow must address land use and work with land use in order to help mitigate biodiversity losses, halt and reverse biodiversity losses. And that means normally protected areas, or at least traditionally we have thought of that in terms of protected areas. You see one here in the Western Ghats, but it also means, and we know that in this community very well, to think about what happens outside these protected areas, such as on the right side of that landscape. So working landscapes, for example, is a concept that we have talked about yesterday in some sessions that comes to mind here. So for this talk, when I talk about conservation, I mean area-based conservation, just to be clear that it refers to both of these things. On the one hand, protected areas, and on the other hand, all conservation measures that happen somewhere on a piece of land. Now, sometimes they are referred to as OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures. So we're talking about that. Okay, so in conservation science, there's an increasing recognition that we need to focus more on land and land use. But despite this, we often see land use being treated pretty simplistically in conservation assessments. So, for example, land cover maps are used to say something about land use, or we're ignoring land use actors, we're ignoring the intensity and the many dimensions of intensity in land use, we're ignoring that land use is dynamic in conservation science. And I'm saying we because I'm also implicit in that, in some of the work that we've done. So this paper makes this point, and you can read more about it there. I'm not going to talk much about this here now. The point being also that by connecting land system science and conservation science, we might move beyond these oversimplifications in conservation assessments. But today I want to make sort of the reverse argument by saying that also in land system science, we are treating conservation, area-based conservation, particularly often overly simplistically. So, for example, we think that we are only talking about protected areas. We think that these protected areas are static, and we think that these protection policies or protected areas are typically happening on residual land that is not otherwise used. And obviously that's not a full description of area-based conservation. Okay, so in the first part now of this of what comes, I would like to make the point that perhaps there is something to gain from seeing conservation and area-based conservation specifically more through the land system lens, by making the point that it might actually not be so different from other forms of land uses that we see in land system. Alright, so the first point here to make then is that area-based conservation, like other land uses, like agriculture, is carried out by actors. And these actors can be acting at different levels, so we could think of managers of protected areas, and those would be perhaps similar to managers of farms, or we could think of people who actually work the land on a farm, and that would be perhaps more similar to the people that you see here, rangers that are actually carrying out the conservation actions on a piece of land. Also, there is a huge diversity in conservation actors, just like in other land uses, and this could be state actors, it could be actors working in NGOs, or it could be private individuals or communities that carry out this area-based conservation. So quite a strong similarity to many other forms of land use. Like other forms of land use, conservation could be seen as having an area footprint. And you see that here in terms of protected areas. Don't need to say much more about that. But perhaps what could also be already noted is that this area footprint also has some sort of intensity attached to it. In this case, the level of strictness or the level of protection also in terms of the IUCN categories. And then in other contexts, we have made the point that maybe when we think about conservation, we should think about the intensity also in more than one dimension. And that you can see here, or the parallels perhaps also to other forms of land use you can see here. We could think, or we typically think for something like agriculture in terms of input intensity and output intensity. So inputs, for example, fertilizer capital, outputs, yields, and revenue. And we could use that lens or so and think about conservation in a similar way. So funding or labor that goes into a protected area, the outcomes such as biodiversity and development. And in conservation science, these two things are sometimes talked about in a slightly confusing way, because both of them are referred to as effectiveness, where the left side, the inputs, refer to management effectiveness, and the right side refers to also effectiveness, but outcome effectiveness. It's also sort of a connected thing. We made this point about the importance of being multidimensional about effectiveness in this paper that Rachael wrote a while ago, and you can take a look at that. Okay, and then also, like other forms of land use, we could see area-based conservation as being dynamic. You've seen this graph many times over. This is the expansion of protected areas, but also there's a lot of work showing that protected areas are actually not static, and they can shrink, they can be downgraded, and even disappear. And that is the PAD phenomena that is highlighted here. And then finally, just as one more example, we could also see area-based conservation in the expansion that you've seen in the graph before through the lens that we normally use in land system science to think about expanding land uses such as frontier dynamics. And here's a paper led by Anna and Siu, both in the room here, that made that point that perhaps it is interesting to think of as conservation as expanding through frontiers. Okay, more things could be said, conservation being a telecoupled process, for example, as well, but I hope that with these slides I could convince you that maybe there are actually many parallels between other land uses and conservation. So now, when is conservation actually a land use and when not? Here you see a picture from a protected area in the Ukrainian Carpathians many times ago from my PhD, where obviously the protected area isn't working as intended. The intention was to protect these old growth forests that are no longer there because they were logged. We suggest that in order to define conservation as a land use, it might be useful to separate three things on land policy, or we call that land policy on the one hand, so the legal or formal ideas about what should happen on a piece of land. So in terms of for agriculture, this could be land zoning, or urban, that could be land zoning. The idea is that agriculture happens in these places. And then in some of these places, perhaps many of these places, actually agriculture happens, such in this maize field in the Brazilian Amazon. So that's the actual land use that's happening on the ground. And then that creates outcomes, yields, but also environmental trade-offs or social trade-offs that are connected to a land use and the land use change, such as. And perhaps it makes sense, it's interesting to think of conservation also in that way. So the policy here is then places that are designated as protected areas. And often in conservation science, we really look at that. And then we sort of think that all these places are actually places where conservation is happening on the ground, but that is not always the case. That's why we talk about paper parks, for instance. And then the outcomes relate to what I said before. We could look at effectiveness of protected areas in many different ways, but you can also think about, are these conservation activities are they leading to unwanted social outcomes? And through this, then, we can also move away from protected areas, but put the same framework on top of other forms of conservation. Here, an example of an OECM, where the actual land use happening on a piece of land would be that this particular area is maintained as a sacred grove because it leads to certain NCPs and biodiversity outcomes that are valuable for local communities. Okay, so now what that could then mean is that we have what we typically see when we see maps of protected areas, some part of landscapes or some part of the globe being designated legally as protected areas. And then we are having another part of the global land surface that is falling under what we now call OECMs or other forms of conservation areas. So areas where conservation is thought to happen. And then conservation as a land use within them would be the areas where actually conservation activities are happening. Okay, and then that doesn't mean that all these areas are working as envisioned, and within that sphere we have a part that is actually effective. And we think that it might be helpful to separate these three things, and it might clear a lot of sort of confusion that we sometimes have when we read in the conservation literature about effectiveness or whether conservation is happening or not. But really, actually, we are talking, for example, about this space only and ignoring the other examples. Okay, this is sort of where we stand, and again, happy to get feedback. We think this could be a useful framing. We highlighted many similarities between area-based conservation and other forms of land uses. The idea would be to separate more clearly policy, what's happening on the ground, and the outcomes. And we think that this could help for integrating conservation in land system science, models, assessments. But also then through that, help to better understand what is actually the footprint of conservation. Not the legal footprint of where conservation is thought to happen, but where it actually happens. Because that, in some ways, is really the challenge that we are facing. Okay, and then finally, this might help us to understand how conservation, in a time when we think conservation areas should increase under 30 by 30, and restoration areas should increase. How is that competing with other land uses? What are the trade-offs that are created? Okay, thank you.
So I appreciate your careful efforts to characterize this kind of paradigm in detail, but from as far as I can tell, land use and conservation are not incompatible. Conservation has always been a land use. I've written papers just assuming that everyone understands that, in which conservation is a land use. And it doesn't need this kind of detailed framework for the simple reason that, well, let's say crops is a land use. What if there's a drought and your crops fail? Is it not crops for a land use? I mean, I don't think there's any relationship necessarily between what's produced as a result. Land use is really ultimately about the intention of and the designation of an area for that intention. What it produces is depends. And so I think conservation is definitely a land use, but I think it already is. I don't think we need a model of it.
Okay.
That's not a question.
It's fine.
No, it's a comment, and it's a good comment, Earl. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, we're not writing the paper for you. I mean, because for you, these things might be clear. Some others, it might be clear as well. We are writing this paper and going through this process because we have been in discussions with conservationists, finding that actually that's not at all the case in the conservation community. We have had really big arguments, heated arguments about conservation not being land use. What we're trying to say. Yeah? So, in conservation, and also I think in this community, I would say that when people think about conservation, they normally think protected areas, and they think about the legality and the policy framework, so the left side, and not what's actually happening on the ground. And that's very much the case in conservation science.
Thank you, Toby. Here. Nice to hear you again. I was wondering, when you talk about conservation areas, I feel like you're talking mostly about places with high biodiversity, mammals, carbon. That's my idea of a protected area, what we want to conserve. Are you also thinking about other things like cultural heritage and patrimony of other things, like the social values of things as well?
Yes, of course, yeah. So to me, that was very much falling under the right side of what this graph showed in the end. So what often is referred to as falling under other effective measures for area-based conservation. But also within the protected areas, there are many types of protected areas that we focus on that we try to emphasize multifunctionality and so on. So for sure, this was not a perspective just in strict protected areas and wildernesses. I even didn't touch on it.
Okay, I'm strict because we've already done 15 minutes, 30 seconds, so I want to make sure the other speakers get their time. We can come back to this because this is the framework, so we can totally come back to this throughout the talks and throughout
And also just to say that there was the idea that because we are stretching over lunch, that for those who want to discuss this, we'll sort of find a table where you can join us and discuss with us.
Yeah. Okay, so I imagine we'll keep coming back to these questions. Thanks to Tobias. Round of applause. Okay, so our next speaker is Jocelyn Tsay from the Autonomous University of Barcelona.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Jocelyn Tsay from Singapore, currently working as a postdoc in the Autonomous University of Barcelona in the Conservation Data Justice Project. I want to say thank you to the session organizers, especially Tobias, for encouraging me to submit because I was very hesitant to do so. And I'm also glad that he already outlined before how he envisioned conservation as a land use. And I will say that moving forward, I'm just talking about area-based conservation in the conservation prioritization literature. So I'll be sharing some very preliminary work on what we've been doing on the conservation prioritization literature, examining the global geospatial data that goes into these prioritization papers and considering their uses and usefulness in light of more justice-oriented frameworks. So conservation has always been framed as a mission-oriented discipline. I come from a conservation background, And it's known that with the distribution of biodiversity and the threats to biodiversity being unequally distributed across the world, and with limited funding, it has been argued since the 1980s, and especially since the turn of the millennium, that we need to prioritize actions and areas for conservation efforts. And so since 2000, by 2006, there's been 9 global prioritization frameworks laid out by mostly big conservation NGOs. And since then, with advancements in digital technologies have meant that there's been a vast increase in the volume of data and the speed at which these data are being incorporated into use, and this is also happening in conservation, as we've heard from many keynote speakers about this being the golden age of remote sensing. So there's been more than 150 global biodiversity data sets that's been compiled, and there's this general rhetoric around data accessibility being a big constraint, with some believing that if only data were more easily and openly available to those who need it, then biodiversity loss will be stopped. I'm not controlling anything. Okay, this is really weird. Can I turn this up? Oh, it's time. Oh, I didn't realize it was time. Oh, that's really annoying. I didn't realize it. I don't use PowerPoint. Happens to me all the time. Okay. So just. Okay, I freaked out for a second during my experience. I don't know. No. Okay, thank you. So yes, there's this general faith in data, and what we're trying to do here now is to question this faith in data approach and seek to consider how different aspects of the data life cycle can introduce injustices, and how the data itself can introduce injustices into conservation, using the Conservation Data Justice Framework that Pritchard et al. Produced in 2022. So this framework considers data composition, what constitutes the data, data control, who has power over it, data access, who is able to obtain the data, data processing and use, how downstream users how downstream users are using the data, the assumptions that they make, and data consequences in reality. Other justice frameworks which have been mentioned, such as distribution, procedural, recognition, epistemic capabilities justice, these all fit onto various aspects of the data lifecycle. Coming back to conservation prioritization, we build on several recent reviews that have been done in this space. So Chimati et al. Identified areas of science policy consensus regions, and more recently, Cobb et al. Reviewed the literature on spatial conservation planning to understand global trends and gaps. On the other hand, global prioritization has also received criticisms for its actual value to conservation and the inability to incorporate local contexts and knowledges at such global scales. And so in this review that was done by Wyborn and Evans. So taking a conservation data justice angle, we conducted this review of the global prioritization literature to examine not just publication trends, authorship networks, how themes have shifted within conservation priorities, what is considered a priority, but also how data layers were constructed, how frequently they were used, accessibility, what techniques or software were used for prioritization, how spatial areas of priority may or may not have shifted over time, and whether or not these have made any impact in policy and actions on the ground. And broadly, what we're looking to do is to ask this broader question of what contributions to science have these prioritization papers been adding. So using Chimati's papers and methods for identifying relevant global prioritization papers as a base, we focused on papers that have already been published that are at a global level, terrestrial, use geospatial data, identify spatially explicit areas of conservation priority and use clear language around prioritization. So they're not just mapping biogeographic patterns. We conducted an updated search using their search protocol and looked in the references of these papers to identify other relevant papers, adding those from the other two reviews that we thought to be relevant as well. For each paper, we read through details for the resolution of the GIS analysis where applicable, identifying all the data layers that have gone into the analysis, writing a description of the data and what it's constituted of, the year or version of the data product, how it was used in the paper, assumptions that were made in its use, and we also made note whether or not the data produced an output, a GIS output that other researchers could use. So we've not completed this analysis, which is why I said preliminary earlier. We've only done about 110 papers. So the figures in the next few slides are very preliminary, incomplete, so don't share it outside of the room. I just wanted to have something to show for this presentation. That answered mostly the low-hanging fruit questions. So unsurprisingly, we find an increase in the publication of papers focusing on global prioritization over time, particularly in the last decade or so. This is not corrected for the overall increase in publication in this field, so I'm not trying to say that there has been more global prioritization exercises compared to other kinds of research. There are some authors who contribute a lot to global prioritization, and these names are probably familiar to most people in the room. And in terms of the most cited global prioritization papers, there are some that are much more popular in the literature than others, particularly Meyer et al.'s 2000 paper on hotspots, which is arguably the first paper that set out areas of global priority with over 19,000 total citations. We have not finished answering most of the more interesting questions yet, which probably most people are interested in. But coming back to the conservation data justice framework, we expect that the review will allow us to answer these questions around what are the most commonly used data products, what is the data that goes into these products, how are they composed, what is made visible, what is hidden, what biases that might be, or assumptions that are made in their use, and kind of as well like whether or not making the data more easily available has facilitated an uptake of that data product in other researchers' work. And if there's time on potentially digging a little more into the more interesting and frequently used data layers. So that's it for me. I think I'm very much on time. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks as well to Danielle, Ryan, who is at the conference, I'm not sure if he's here, and Dan for helping me with the review. And I'll be very happy for any questions or comments, especially because this is still work in progress. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So we have time for questions. Yeah, go
ahead. Great work, excellent. I think it's going to go very well. My only question is with regards to the language, and especially because I think there's some research that shows that the Western perspective is sometimes very strong in conservation and global views. So maybe if you include other languages into the review, you're going to find some interesting aspects that can be missing.
Do you mean like looking at non-English language papers?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's a good one.
It's always a good one.
Yeah.
You're next.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for the talk. You don't have a lot of results, but I just wanted to kind of get your suspicions, impressions from what you've been, so that we have a sneak peek of what is coming.
That's a really tough one. I think it's in terms of themes, I think the earlier papers in the 2000s have focused much more on things like functional diversity, phylogenetic diversity. They incorporate biological traits, because there's this whole thing about like what is conservation actually doing? Why are we trying to prioritize areas that are useless? You know, kind of leading on from what Tobias had said before about not marginal lands being used for conservation. So there was this I think focus on the more biological value of conservation priorities. And in more recent years, it's much more on ecosystem services, nature's contributions to people, kind of framing. So there is that slight shift. It would be very interesting to know if these spatially overlap, which we haven't got around to yet, but I think that is one of the more interesting things that have come up.
So I have a question, and then I'll go to Millie. Sorry, I really want to ask a question because you have an amazing data set. So I was wondering, first of all, why you don't split conservation and restoration. And then also whether you have any intention to look at the gender dynamic and the global minority, global majority aspect, because that list of sort of top impact, it's so heavily skewed to European, white males.
Do you mean in terms of the authors?
To look at the sort of embedded power relations in like the conservation versus the restoration literatures.
Thank you. I think the thing about conservation versus restoration is that the restoration literature is much more recent. I don't know, people are looking at me, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but the bias hotspots are talking about conservation prioritization, whereas if you look at the one that was most cited that have made it into the top list, Carsten et al. Was about tree restoration, and then Strasbourg was also kind of around restoration. It is just much more recent. Sorry, maybe it would be interesting to separate them out, but I think it would be nice to just keep them in together and then consider them differently. But the gender dynamics and the power relations would also be quite interesting.
Thanks, Jocelyn. This is super cool, and I'm really excited to see kind of how it develops. My question is thinking about kind of the data composition question and data availability question. Are you thinking primarily about like data disparities within the like synthesized data that's generally like driving these global prioritizations, and or the dimensions of this problem of prioritizing conservation that just like aren't reduced into global data sets themselves? Like it's like a bias within existing data sets versus a bias in what we have data on.
That's an interesting question. So your question was around whether we're looking at the data that's already available or the bias within what? Right. Okay. So I think we are looking at accessibility just in terms of whether other people can access the data sets that people are talking about and are using. So I won't name kind of anything I won't be specific, but there are some very well-known, well-publicized papers whose underlying data set you just cannot find anything on. Like there is no published literature, there is no actual geospatial data set. People just talk. They say, we created this layer of this thing, and there is nothing around it. And these are very, very well-cited papers that we're talking about. So it kind of is more around that aspect rather than the bias in and of itself, because I think there are quite a lot of papers in STS studies, etc., science and technology studies that kind of look within what is already available and the bias is there. So we're trying to kind of think more about the end users. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent presentation. Amazing. Like, three questions actually very quickly. No, just no. It's one long one. So now the first one: how did you accommodate like the change in number of journals that from 2000 now? Also, how did you accommodate the amount of possibilities to do large-scale GIS and remote sensing analysis for the globe, also with time, like from 2000 to now? And okay, I'll stay with these two.
Thank you. So I guess your question was around like the general increase in global prioritization papers. I don't. That isn't really a central question for us. Like this is a trend that is happening. I wasn't. Absolutely. I mean, if you think absolutely, this is down to global north bias, institutions that have access to high computing power, whatever the HPCs are, cloud computing, those who are already trained. This is absolutely all in there. Again, I don't think that's a central focus for me because it is something that we all know, yes, maybe you could do with another paper that says, oh, look, who's doing all the global prioritization papers is all the global north people again. But I think the more interesting questions around how the data is actually made, what it's actually made of, like what are the visible and invisible biases, because global north institutions can also do good work, right? And global north researchers can also do good work. So it's not it's not a very good answer, but I think it's something we think about, but not a central driving focus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Obviously, a lot. Yeah. a lot to be able to dig into there. So our next speaker is Yujin from oh my gosh, sorry. Yeah. There's so many authors on this paper that I couldn't see. From the Nature Conservancy, which everybody knows.
Hi. Okay, so I just I don't know why do I even have animation for my name? Hi everyone, I'm Sue. I'm currently based at the Nature Conservancy, but before that I was working with Tobias in the lab, conservation biogeography lab in Kuemmerle University of Berlin. And today I'm just to confuse everyone a little bit more. So far we've been talking about we need to protect whatever percentage of the Earth. What do we mean by protect that much percentage? Normally you will have this map in your head, and that's probably what everyone shows in their slides. That's probably what Jocelyn found every prioritization work is using. And this is the World Database of Protected Areas. Traditionally or conventionally, we only talk about these terrestrial, these protected areas. And now there are some progress of including these other effective area-based conservation measures. And if you can actually see the color on the screen, you'll see there are not many other stuff reported there yet, because there's a whole process of what is effective, when are they counted as conservation, so all these questions. So in the end, you have like maybe 13 countries or some things with something reported there. The issue with the data is that first we have a very top-down defined category with what's counted as protected area, or OECM. And then with the whole reporting scheme is also like you need to report to government, or the government report directly to them. If you report directly to them, it needs to be verified by the government. So there's many things that is not currently captured by that map, either because they don't meet the definition, or there are some barriers for them to actually go through the process. A very simple example is this protected area designated by the indigenous autonomous government in Brazil. And they already announced it as a protected area, designated as a protected area within their autonomous legal framework in 2014. And I think it became a municipality level official protected area based by the Bolivian municipal government by 2019. And the maps is already everywhere. Even on IUCN website, they announced it as a nice indigenous protected area. But if you check the WDPA today, it's still not there. Of course, the actual story is a little bit more complicated than that. But basically, if you check, but this thing has been talked about as a protected area, for example, in Mongabay since 2019, and because of all the struggles, there has been effectiveness issues there. But it's like other protected areas; they kind of also have that. So in parallel to that official process of clarifying what counts as a protected area, what is an OECM, how do we report, who should report, it's also possible for us as the scientists or the civil society to track area-based conservation. And here by area conservation, I meant, of course, you need to have a defined area boundary. It has to be conservation on site. If it's a zoo, it does not count. It has to be something managed with conservation intention, or maybe in ways that have potential conservation outcomes. For example, maybe indigenous people would not say they are managing their territory for biodiversity conservation, but if their practice aligns with what may have a conservation outcome, we probably should count them. And also, mostly because this is what everyone is envisioning as area protected, we put long-term there. But it can be intentional or potential because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Also, the whole process can happen more inclusively. By inclusive, we mean we will include input from all types of actors. It can be from the government, but it also can from knowledge from this is okay. Maybe there's also anyways. So we include all types of actors and their input, and we try to include more evidence, not just based on peer-reviewed literature, but also great literature, expert knowledge, and local knowledge. Like if the community on the ground says we are managing it in a way that's kind of delivering conservation outcome, then we can already include them in the tracking, while the effective question, we can always assess them later. And in this practice, we did a system-level based reviewing, just because site-level based reviewing is taking too much time. And we don't have predefined categories in terms of what counts as area-based conservation, but it's moving faster than I talk. But the category is looking at what's actually on the ground, what information we get, and we do flexible and empirically grounded categorization based on the type of things we found in the ground, on the ground. So the whole process led to, so we reviewed all the legal documents and literature we can find, and we also talked with, still we together? Time to hit. Anyways, so we talked with the researchers from most of the Amazonian countries we worked with, and we found that there are over 40% of areas that kind of meet the loosely defined area-based conservation we just talked about. Also, that's if we only look at within the Amazon biome, that's over 60%. Sure. And within that, we cover a lot of areas, not just I can just go to this one. You don't have to read through all the categories we found there, because that's a lot. There are things managed by the government, but also by communities and private owners, or through contracts between different actors. But basically, we compared that. So that data was already collected in 2016, and we compared with the WDPA and WDOECM covered categories by 2023. And we found there are way more things, that there are polygon data or statistical data available on the ground that's not currently included by WDPA and WDOECM. Maybe for a justified reason, because there they have different criteria and processes. But the point is, when we are thinking about what's actually happening on the ground, we can probably broaden our view or the type of things we want to include in our analysis, and not be too tight to what's officially out there that's going through a more tight processes and not as inclusive. And we did some opportunistic check with what's the situation globally. So based on landmark, there are about 55% of lands customarily held by indigenous people and local communities. There are also like almost 1% of global land under FSC certified forest. Many of them are being like selectively cut and sustainably managed, but supposedly at least the 10% of their land should be set aside and reserved. And if they are not within the existing protected areas, we are not counting them in our current understanding of what's being conserved. Then there are all the biodiversity offsets. A much smaller percentage of the world. Some actually overlap with protected areas, but it's also not very complete pictures. Basically, the message here is there are more. We know there are more, and there are even data out there that you can use. And maybe we can just use them. Which means, for land system science may agree or disagree, but that's what I thought. As you said, Tobias, area-based conservation is it can be a broader concept, and it's diverse, and it's dynamic, and it's probably even beyond just PAs and OECMs. And I think the least we can do now is, in all the regions you are working in, you know the area much better than whoever put together the global database. So maybe at the system you are working, you can already start to consider and inventory a broader scope of area-based conservations and also actors doing these type of things, and consider them in the spatial planning for prioritization work, and maybe for impact evaluation to understand what's the true impact of something comparing to all the other things that existed out there, and also managing areas in a way that's aligning with conservation focus, and to leverage and elevating local and expert knowledge in the process. And for conservation science, so I've been thinking that a lot of the OECM discussion is around we need to figure out what are the things that's actually effective. Then we recognize them and report them. Then you get the support to make sure they are effective. But there might be other ways to look at the question. For example, maybe we can look at what support we can provide to these areas out there that may have a conservation-related intent or practices, so that they can realize their visions and potential that's related to conservation. Time's up. Okay. Sure. Thank you. So, they're going to say, 1 second. I think there's something important, so I'll take 1 second. But if you already want to ask your question, you can start to ask your question. That may lead me to my... Yes, I said that. Anyways, never mind. But anyways, I think it's important for us to broaden our understanding of conservation areas so we can support things and not being the gatekeeper and keeping things out. Sorry, the coffee. And what else? What else can we do now? Maybe there's some data sharing and compilation at local, national level, regional level we can already do. And here there are many people working in many different fields and systems. I will leave it to you to figure out what we can do. The paper is actually already published. If you have all the questions on what are all the categories and our definitions, you can scan that code. And this one is a commentary piece with this. And it's co-led by Flora, who's also sitting here, and with also many other co-authors through organizations. And these organizations covered our time. Thank you. Questions? Is it competing? It's after your afternoon session. Is it? It's after, I checked.
Thanks to you. That was super interesting. I just feel the need to kind of say something slightly on behalf of the guys that manage the WDPA, because that data comes from kind of reports by their local and their national partners. So perhaps the discrepancy you found, I mean, I guess this is kind of what maybe you go into more detail in the paper, but is kind of mostly due to different understandings of what people count as these OECMs. You know, so maybe kind of the reporting agencies are aware of these places, but they think that they don't meet the criteria to be included. And so maybe kind of better, I don't know, description, maybe widening the criteria, making sure that everyone understands what that actually means could kind of help fill in these gaps. Do you think?
Yes, we do. We covered that in the paper.
Yeah, okay.
But I can explain a little bit. So first, we are not trying to criticize them because there's very good use of global database, and they have a different purpose because everything there has policy implications. Because there it's like whether it's counting towards the 30% of your commitment or not. What we were saying is because that process is more strict, slightly more top-down, and there are way more policy implications that make the process a little bit more tight. While what's actually happening out there, we can start something in parallel, especially if you're not working at global level. You don't have to be restricted by either their definition of one thing counts or not, if your local partners has a different view, especially if they are not conservation partners, but also communities, and they feel like their way is making contribution to biodiversity, but they don't want to be counted that way, or they do not want to be as strict. So basically it's a parallel thing that we're thinking of. It's to complement both their definition and ways of reporting. Yes.
Great presentation. I'm working something similar, so we have to talk about. So when you think about OECMs, you start thinking also on a gradient of effectiveness, no? Maybe. So in relation to biodiversity. But then in my mind, I was also thinking there's also a gradient of impact to socioeconomic impact to the local communities. So that's another aspect that I haven't been able to digest and find a way to understand. But that's my question, basically. If you have thought about that other side of the coin.
Yes, thanks. That's a very important question. So in this work, we basically just collected information on where are those areas and how are they managed. And a very important question would be to look at how effective they are, or what's the impact they are, not just environmentally, but also socially, economically, and given the different contexts. Because protected area does not work everywhere. And I probably should have clarified that we are not suggesting everything here should be counted as OECM. There can be things beyond OECM. Yeah, so I think the key question is who should draw the line? Why are we drawing the line? For what purposes? Because there are many different ways to draw the line between, oh, this is protected, this is not protected. Or should we even draw the line at all? Okay, that's too progressive. But area-based conservation is not the end, it's the means, basically.
Thanks a lot. I've taken the liberty of turning off timings and narrations and all sorts of shenanigans. So our next speaker is Marcellus Caldas from Kansas State, and he is a new member of the Science Steering Committee of the Global Land Program.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Rachael. My colleagues that know my work in the Amazon, in the Cerrado, and the Chaco, ask me, so what's the motivation for you, to talk about wildfire in the Great Plains? That's one of the things that was saying. And I tell them, well, we are always looking at the global south, right? So we are from the global north are what's going on in the global south in terms of conservation. And for me, the biggest motivation is what's going on in my backyard in the global north. Now, that's one motivation. The other motivation, it's something that I saw all the time in the news, and probably many of you are seeing all the time in the news. So we are seeing wildfire in Australia, Canada, wildfire in the Brazilian Amazon, California. So we are seeing wildfire in many, many different places. In the Brazilian Cerrado. And this has caught attention for two main reasons. The first, biodiversity. The biodiverse loss in many of these places. The second one is the wildland urban interface. These are the two things that has caught attention of the wildfire in many of these locations. And many scholars are discussing this type of things. And the main conclusion so far is that people are moving to these places. Right? This is one of the biggest things that you have seen in the literature. Talks well. People are being pushed to live in this nice place where wildfire is occurring. And I had interest in look at some. So I have an interest to look at another region where, for me, it's very important, economically, and because of the ecological significance for the U.S. that the Great Plains. I think that you guys know the importance of the Great Plains. The region that I live is one of the big beef producer. GBS is there. In Dodge cities. Many parts of the Hayes and so on. One of the biggest producers of wheat, very critical for biodiversity, and we don't pay much attention in terms of what kind of biodiversity exists in the Great Plains, especially in the southern Great Plains. We live in the top of the aquifer, the Agualala aquifer, where the projections from K-State are showing that by 2050 we have been basically use 40% of the whole water in the aquifer. And We are also producer of cotton, sorghum, hay, and so on. So, wildfires or fire, is part of the ecosystem in the Great Plains. We have seen this for many, many years. There are a lot of studies talk about wildfires or fire in the Great Plains. Very important for development of short grass, mixed grass, and so on. It also controls, invasive species of trees. So what happened? We suppressed the practice of fire in the Great Plains. For 100 years, that's one thing was not happening. And the main consequences of the wildfire in the region, we changed the fire regime, ecologically speaking. That was the main consequence for that. We start to see mega fires in the region. 50% of all mega fire in the United States is in the Great Plains. It's not in the West Coast. It's not in the East Coast. It's in the Great Plains. So we moved from thousands of hectares burned a year for millions of hectares. Right? That's one of the things that's happening, and you can see by the pictures there, they are very close to many cities in the Great Plains. So, just to give you an idea of the megafires are fires that are more than 100,000 hectares, or 100,000 acres, 40,000 hectares. We had 16 megafires between 2006 and 2018. 2 million acres were burned, and new predictions are showing that between 50 to 100%, 150% now will increase in terms of fire in the region. Some regions are going to have more than 7% chance to have big wildfire, much more bigger than what we're talking about here. So we wrote a proposal to NSF, talk and say, what's the perception? We live in the Great Plains. People that know the mentality of farmers in the Great Plains know what I'm talking about. So we wrote a proposal to NSF to look at what is the perception of the fire, the farmers or land owners to the wildfire in the region. And we decided to look at just the southern Great Plains. So we have some specific objectives. It's much larger than that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these things here. So look at the perception of the fire, especially frequency intensity. We're going to evaluate wildfires, land owner conservation practice. Conservation practice is a little bit different from what I'm talking about here. Not talk about forest. Okay, so we'll talk about managing the land and assess if they are mitigating or adapt to the wildfire. So these are preliminary work. Okay, we have a survey. We are still collecting the data and use the data where I develop focal groups and semi-structured interview to understand the data that we have. So we developed this survey based on in a few questions where users like at the scale to look at the statement to see the perception of the farmers of DSC. And the data that I present here are preliminary. So we are using this to formulate the new question for semi-structured for focal groups with this, the farms. Things that are interesting to look at. When you ask the intensity of the fire increase significantly in your area, you're going to look at that just only 30% thinks that the wildfire is growing. Although the data is showing that not, it's much more than that. Now, they are used to see fire, but they don't know the difference between fire and wildfire. That's one of the big things that we see there. The threat of the fire is not big enough to justify mitigation efforts in my operation management. So that's one statement. If you look at that, the majority, 38% of the producers agree with this statement. Yeah, no, I'm not going to change our movement. So although wildfires happen, they're not going to make any change in managing the land. So when you look at no-till, that's a conservation practice. Or conservation tillage practice. We ask the question that we ask, have the state practice of no-till and conservation tillage practice increase the risk of the fire? And say 40% they don't know. They don't have any idea if that thing is helping or not. So what's the effect of no-till, or conservation, cover crops, for instance, in the property? Okay. Here's an example of a cover crops. 43% disagree with the statement that cover crops could be one thing in terms of increased wildfire in the region. So, in terms of conservation reserve program, so we have data of the conservation reserve program for the whole United States. We select part of the Great Plains to do a spatial analysis of this conservation, and would they state that conservation helps to reduce the loss from wildfire? They don't know. So they have the conservation in the farm, but they don't know if it's help or not. We decided to do some statistical analysis in terms of look at the perception of the farmers in terms of land and CRP increase, how often wildfires occur in the local area. So that's one thing that's very, very interesting. We have a few variables there, experience of wildfire. In here, if you look at here, although significant, the sign of that is negative. So what that means? That means that people that had wildfire in their land, they have the gamble fallacy. It's not going to happen again because it's all happened over. So we are okay. So that's something that's very interesting when you look at this type of information. The other one, you see here, area burned. So more areas burned in the property, more they believe that things that the frequency is going to increase. When they look at all the information, you see here the experience again with the wildfire is very important. Risked, although significant, has a different sign. So when you look at the 15 years, the questions compared to 15 years ago, wildfires occur more often than your local area. If you look at the results here, they are all what to expect, significant and positive. So they have these perceptions for long term and look at the wildfire, but the short term, distances is also not important for them. Can burn in my neighbor, but it's not burning mine, it's fine, I'm okay. So that's one thing that's very interesting. In terms of severity, it's the same. So severity is very interesting. In terms of mitigation, the only things that affect them is uncertainty to mitigate. Say, more uncertainty you are, more risk averse probably you are, you're gonna mitigate. In the last one, adaptation. Only the ones that had experience of the wildfire in the property, in more uncertain they are about this, they're gonna adapt to the wildfire. So this is a preliminary work, but we are using this to formulate new questions for the semi-structured interview and for groups.
Question? Oh.
Thanks for the talk. That was interesting. It's a slightly different question, but are there any considerations around Native American indigenous fire management practices? Would it be possible that landowners might be more interested in that in terms of trying to control wildfires? Because I think that is quite a current topic now, trying to incorporate more indigenous land management practices and using it to manage how fires given current trends.
It's an excellent question. One of the big indigenous practices is prescribed burning, right? And by different locations, you can see that people don't use prescribed fire there because they are afraid of the law. For instance, in Texas, in Oklahoma, if the prescribed fire moves from one farm to the other, you're going to be sued, right, for not controlling. And people that help it, you're going to be sued too. So that's one of the big issues in terms of prescribed fire. That's one of the biggest, and we collected 500 questionnaires now from Texas, Oklahoma, to try to understand what are the barriers for prescribed fires in the region, why they don't have, for instance, associates for prescribed fire.
Okay, well, I can ask one. I can always think of one. So I've seen similar work in the general adaptation to climate change literature and land use, not actually in the land system science community, but they use theory of planned behavior and other things to try to sort of make sense of all of this. What is the underlying theoretical framework that you have in mind, sort of, for analyzing this behavior in light of especially in light of the past experience finding?
Yeah, one of the things that we are trying to do is use the VBM framework, value beliefs and norms, and try to use that framework to understand what are the beliefs for these farmers or landowners, what are the norms that they have. And it's very interesting because when you talk to the farmers in this community, they tell you, well, I would like to do prescribed fire. And they say, why you don't do it? Well, my community doesn't like prescribed fire. And I cannot go against the community. I depend on them to do whatever the work I need to do in my farm. Now, if I need to get water or a tractor, and I start to use prescribed fire, they're not going to see me as part of the community. So the norms that they have in the community, the values that they have, it's much more stronger, in terms of the decision, what they do. So we are trying to use the VBM framework to try to understand these beliefs and norms.
That's great. Okay. Well, that's exciting to me because that's a framework that we're using to guide a whole experiment that we're doing. So thanks for that. I don't see any more questions, and let's another round of applause. Thank you so much. And so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative of just saying that I still think there's some conceptual clarity to be added in this space that you guys can definitely continue to discuss over lunch. Because we had a focus in the beginning on protected areas and OECMs, but we also had things like fire, which are more of a land management strategy. And then we had the conservation reserve program, and we have also things like the forest code in Brazil, and those do not fall into the OECM category. And I'm always fighting with people about that. And so there's still some, I think some going back to your question, Earl, in the beginning, there's still duh, it's a land use, but also when is it not a land use? It's another way of framing your question. Is it ever not a land use? Yeah. So I agree. There's a lot more to be thought about and fleshed out, and I think it's helpful because in the broader international conversations, they only count certain things in this bucket of 30% or 20%. They don't count other things. So yeah, anyway, hopefully we can continue to tackle this over lunch. And in the next session, do you guys have a strong disagreement with what I'm saying right now? No? Okay, cool. So go eat. I'm ravenous, and we will reconvene. Thanks.
Maybe just to go back to what we said in the beginning, so we'll probably try to find a table close to the dancing part of the outside. So if you want to discuss a bit over lunch, for example, about whether conservation is a land use or not, you're welcome to go there, and we can do that.